The snow began falling long before the moon rose. It drifted down through the blackthorn forest in heavy, silent sheets, swallowing sound and light alike, as if the world itself wished to forget what lay beneath it. The trees stood tall and skeletal, their blackened branches tangled high overhead, blocking out what little starlight dared to reach the ground. Frost clung to every surface, coating bark and stone alike in a brittle sheen that cracked beneath the weight of time. The air was sharp enough to cut, each breath burning the lungs before fading into pale clouds. No one came here at night. The villagers knew better. When darkness crept across the land, doors were barred. Fires were smothered. Prayers were whispered into trembling hands. The forest did not belong to humans after sunset. It belonged to something older. Something patient. Something that had ruled this land long before fear learned how to speak. And yet, through the deepening snow, a child walked. He was small, thin as a winter branch, his body wrapped in little more than a threadbare coat and torn trousers stiff with ice. His feet were bare against the frozen ground, each step sinking into snow that reached past his ankles. The cold had numbed them hours ago, turning pain into a dull, constant ache that spread slowly up his legs. Still he kept moving. In his arms he carried a cloth sack tied with fraying twine. It was heavy, not with weight but with meaning. Inside were crusts of bread hardened by age, roots dug from frozen soil, and a single bruised apple he had found discarded behind a merchant's stall. He had gathered it all from dawn until dusk. Every piece had cost him something. A scraped hand. A hungry hour. A moment of humiliation. It was everything he had. The boy's breath came in shallow bursts, fogging the air before his face. His fingers trembled around the sack not only from the cold but from fear. He should not have been here. He knew that. But his mother lay sick in their small, crumbling home, her fever worsening with each passing hour. The villagers had turned them away. The healer demanded coin they did not have. And so, when the last scraps of food were gone, the boy had done the only thing left to him. He had gone into the forest. At first there were sounds. The crunch of snow beneath his feet. The distant call of something hunting in the dark. The whisper of wind threading through thorn branches. But the deeper he went, the quieter the world became. Even the wind seemed to falter, as though uncertain whether it was welcome here. Then, suddenly, the forest went completely still. The boy stopped walking. His heart slammed against his ribs, sharp and panicked. The silence pressed in on him, heavy and unnatural. It felt as though the forest itself had turned to watch him. His breath caught in his throat. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to turn back, to abandon the food and flee. But he did not. Something had found him. He felt it before he saw it. A weight in the air, ancient and vast like the moment before a storm breaks. The shadows ahead of him shifted, not with the movement of light, but with purpose. They thickened, pooling together, rising from the snow and the roots of the blackthorn trees as if summoned. The darkness took shape. A tall figure stepped forward, draped in a cloak darker than the night itself. It did not move with the wind. It did not rustle. It simply existed as if it had always been there and the world was only just noticing. Pale hair framed a face too perfect to be kind, sharp and cold like a blade forged for one purpose alone. Eyes the color of winter ice fixed on the boy. The vampire king had come. For 300 years, his name had haunted this land. Mothers used it to frighten disobedient children. Soldiers spoke it before battles they did not expect to survive. Villages left offerings at the forest's edge, hoping to be ignored. No one stood before him willingly. The boy's knees shook so violently he thought he might collapse. His chest tightened until it hurt to breathe. The sack slipped slightly in his grasp and he clutched it tighter, pulling it close to his heart as if it might shield him. The vampire king did not speak. He did not need to. The cold around him deepened, pressing down like a physical force. The snow beneath his feet did not crunch. It did not shift. He was a part of the forest now. No, more than that. He was its ruler. The boy swallowed hard. He could feel tears burning behind his eyes, but he forced them back. Crying would do nothing. Running would only make it worse. Somewhere inside his small, terrified body, something steadier rose to the surface. Not bravery. Not courage. Love. He thought of his mother's face, pale with fever. Her hand in his hair earlier that morning, gentle even in pain. The way she had smiled at him, trying to hide how weak she was. His fingers stopped shaking. Slowly, deliberately, the boy took a step forward. Snow crunched loudly beneath his bare feet, the sound echoing far too much in the silence. He lifted the sack with both hands, holding it out in front of him like an offering. Or a shield. Or a plea. His voice cracked when he spoke. "Please," he whispered. The word was thin, fragile, almost lost to the cold. But it reached its target. "Please don't take our food," he continued, forcing the words out one by one. "We saved all day for this." The sentence ended in a soft, broken breath. The words hung in the air between them, trembling. The forest did not move. The Vampire King stared at the boy, his expression unreadable. He did not look at the sack. He did not look at the food. His gaze was fixed on the child's face, the fear there, yes, but also something else. Resolve. Desperation. A willingness to stand and be broken rather than abandon what little he had left. In 3 centuries the king had heard every kind of plea. Men begged for their lives with gold at his feet. Soldiers promised loyalty in exchange for mercy. Parents screamed, offered themselves, cursed him with their dying breath. No one had ever asked him not to take. No one had ever assumed he might listen. The Vampire King tilted his head slightly, studying the boy as one might study an anomaly, something that should not exist, yet undeniably did. "Why?" he asked at last. His voice was low, calm, and infinitely dangerous. The boy flinched but did not step back. His throat tightened. "My mother is sick," he said quietly. "She hasn't eaten." The truth landed between them like a blow. Something stirred beneath the king's ribs, something old and unwelcome. He sensed it then, faint but undeniable. Death nearby. Not the boy's. Not yet. Someone else's life flickered weakly in the darkness, tethered to this child by love and necessity. The Vampire King's jaw tightened. Without another word he stepped past the boy. The movement was sudden, fluid, terrifying. One moment he was there, towering and terrible. The next he was gone, swallowed by the deeper shadows of the forest. The silence rushed back in. The boy's legs gave out. He fell to his knees in the snow, clutching the sack of food to his chest as if it might disappear if he let go. His breath came in ragged gasps. He was alive. Somehow, impossibly, he was alive. Snow continued to fall, soft and relentless. The boy did not know why he had been spared. He did not know that, for the first time in 300 years, the Vampire King had chosen mercy over hunger. And deep in the blackthorn forest, hidden beneath frozen brambles and forgotten prayers, the fate of them both had begun to change. Winter did not arrive gently. Came like a verdict. The wind cut through the village as if it were searching for something it had lost long ago. Snow buried footsteps within minutes, erasing proof that anyone had ever tried to survive here at all. Chimneys smoked weakly. Doors stayed bolted long before sunset. And beyond the last crooked fence, the forest waited. The blackthorn. Its trees were skeletal giants, branches clawing at the sky, their shadows stretching unnaturally far when the moon rose. No bird sang there. No animal crossed its edge willingly. Even sound seemed to lose its courage before entering. That was where the Vampire King ruled. Not from a throne of stone or gold, but from fear itself. The boy had not planned to return to the forest. But hunger does not care about plants. His mother had been coughing again, deep, hollow coughs that rattled her chest and left her shaking. Their food stores were nearly gone. The last loaf of bread had been split into careful pieces days ago, each bite measured, each swallow heavy with guilt. That morning she had tried to smile. "I'll be fine," she said, though her hands trembled as she brushed his hair. "You don't need to. I'll be back before dark," he lied gently. She knew. But she let him go. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he crossed the boundary into the forest. The air changed instantly. Colder. Thicker. As though the darkness itself was breathing. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back. Stories flooded his mind, children vanishing, travelers found bloodless, entire families erased for trespassing. The Vampire King did not hunt often. But when he did, no one escaped. The boy clutched the small sack at his side. Inside was a loaf of bread. His last offering. He did not scream when the shadows moved. He froze. They poured from the trees like ink spilling into water, coiling, twisting, forming a shape taller than any man. Red eyes opened within the darkness, ancient and measuring. The Vampire King stepped forward. His presence bent the forest around him. Snow did not fall where he stood. Branches bowed. Time itself seemed to hesitate. "You return," the king said, his voice smooth and dangerous. "Why?" The boy swallowed hard. "My mother is sick," he said, "and we have no food left." Silence followed. Then a laugh, low, sharp, humorless. "You humans always arrive with excuses," the king said. "Fear. Love. Hunger. You call it necessity. I call it weakness." The boy's knees trembled, but he did not run. "I brought something," he said. Slowly, carefully, he reached into the sack and held out the bread. The Vampire King stared at it. Bread. Not gold. Not blood. Not a plea. Bread. You think this buys mercy? The king asked. No, the boy replied. I think it proves I'm not here to take. The forest seemed to lean in. The Vampire King stepped closer, his red eyes burning into the boy's soul. He could hear the boy's heartbeat, fast, uneven, terrified. Yet still the boy stood. Everyone else comes here desperate to steal, the king said. You bring your last meal and offer it freely. The boy's voice shook. If you're going to take my life, at least let my mother eat. The words landed like a blade. Not dramatic. Not loud. Honest. The Vampire King had ruled for centuries. He had seen warriors beg, kings bargain, priests curse him in the name of gods long dead. None of them had ever offered kindness without expecting survival. None of them had ever been a child. Go, the king said suddenly. The boy blinked. What? Go, the Vampire King repeated. Before I change my mind. The boy did not hesitate. He ran. Snow swallowed his footsteps behind him. The forest fell silent again. That should have been the end. It wasn't. The Vampire King stood alone beneath the trees, staring at the bread in his hand. It was warm. Still fresh. A thing made by human hands for human need. He could have crushed it. Let it rot. Let the moment fade like every other. Instead he placed it on a stone. And waited. The boy returned the next night. And the next. Sometimes with bread. Sometimes with apples. Sometimes with nothing but stories, of his mother's fever breaking, of neighbors sharing what little they had, of children learning to laugh again. The Vampire King never asked him to come. The boy never asked for protection. They spoke of nothing important. That was what changed everything. The king began to notice things. How the boy listened instead of begging. How he never flinched when the king grew silent. How he asked questions, not about power but about time. Do you remember being human? The boy asked once. The Vampire King did not answer. Not because he couldn't, but because the memory hurt. One night the boy did not come. Then another passed. Then a third. The forest grew restless. On the fourth night, the Vampire King crossed the boundary of the Blackthorn. For the first time in centuries. The village was quiet. Too quiet. He found the boy's home by instinct. The door was open. Inside, the boy knelt beside his mother, holding her hand, whispering comfort as her breathing slowed. She looked up and saw the shadow in the doorway. She did not scream. Please, she said softly. If you're here to take something, take me. Not him. The Vampire King felt something crack. He stepped forward, and instead of death he brought warmth. The fever broke before dawn. When the sun rose, the Vampire King was gone. But the boy knew. Something had changed. Not in the forest. In the world. And far away beneath ancient trees, the Vampire King stood alone, staring at his hands. They were no longer stained with blood. They were stained with choice. Winter did not loosen its grip on the land. If anything, it tightened. Snow fell thicker now, piling high against cottages and fences, sealing doors and burying paths beneath layers of white silence. Hunger followed close behind, creeping into homes where warmth once lived. People spoke in hushed voices and avoided the forest more than ever, because strange things had begun to happen there. The wolves no longer hunted near the village. Bandits who once stalked the roads vanished without a trace. And every time cruelty reached too far, something unseen pushed back. At the center of it all was a small boy who walked through the Blackthorn forest as if it were no longer a place of death. He still wore the same thin coat. His boots were still patched and worn. Poverty had not left him. But fear had loosened its hold. The boy walked carefully through the snow, a small bundle tucked beneath his arm. This time, it was not desperation that guided him into the forest. It was something quieter. Something deliberate. He stopped near a flat stone half buried beneath frost, a place where the trees bent inward as if listening. Slowly he knelt and unwrapped the bundle. Inside lay a single piece of bread, broken carefully in half. He placed it on the stone. For you, he said softly, his voice barely carrying through the cold air. In case you're hungry too. Then he stood, brushed the snow from his knees and walked away without looking back. High above him, hidden among the tangled shadows, the Vampire King watched. He did not move. He did not breathe. For a long moment he did not understand what he had seen. No bargain had been spoken. No plea had been made. The boy had not even waited to see if the offering would be accepted. He had simply given, without expectation, without fear. The king felt something stir beneath the ice that had sealed his heart for centuries. A pressure. A crack. No one had ever offered him food. Not kings. Not priests. Not parents desperate to save their children. Humans offered sacrifices to appease him. Offerings to distract him. Never kindness. The bread sat untouched on the stone as snow dusted its surface. The king descended silently, shadows folding around him as he stepped into the clearing. He stared at the bread as if it were an artifact from a forgotten world. Slowly he knelt and picked it up. It was stale. Cold. Worthless. And yet his fingers tightened around it as if it mattered. That night he did not feed. The boy returned home to find his mother sitting upright for the first time in weeks. Her color had returned. Her eyes were clearer. She smiled when she saw him, and the sight struck him harder than hunger ever had. He dropped his bundle and ran to her, burying his face against her side. "You're warm," he whispered in disbelief. She laughed softly and pulled him close. "So are you." The boy did not speak of the forest. He did not speak of the vampire king. Some things felt too fragile for words. But that night as he slept, the shadows watched over the house. When a thief crept too close, fear drove him away before his hand touched the door. When sickness brushed the edge of the boy's dreams, it passed without taking hold. Protection had settled around him like a second skin. Days passed. Then weeks. The boy began to sense when the forest was watching him, not with menace but with awareness. The feeling no longer made his chest tighten. Instead, it brought a strange sense of calm. One night, as snow fell softly and the moon hung low, the boy spoke again into the darkness. "You don't have to hide," he said, his voice steady. "I know you're there." Silence answered him. Then, from the shadows between the trees, the vampire king stepped forward. The boy's breath caught, but he did not run. They stood facing one another, the child small and human, the king tall and terrible. The contrast was stark, almost painful to look at. "You are not afraid," the king said. The boy shook his head. "I was. Before. What changed?" "You didn't take our food." The king studied him for a long moment. "Most would call that mercy." The boy frowned slightly, thinking. "I think you were just listening." The words landed deeper than any blade. That night, the vampire king sat on a fallen log while the boy stood nearby, telling him about his day. About gathering firewood. About how his mother smiled more now. About how the villagers still looked at him with suspicion, but some had begun to leave food at their door without explanation. The king did not interrupt. He listened. For the first time in centuries, he listened without hunger clawing at his ribs. As the nights continued, their meetings became a quiet ritual. The boy would talk. The king would watch. Sometimes the king spoke, answering questions in careful, measured words. He taught the boy how to move silently through snow. How to listen to the forest's warnings. How to stand his ground without raising his voice. "Strength doesn't come from being feared," the king said once. "It comes from being steady." The boy nodded, absorbing every word. Slowly, subtly, the king began to change. He no longer punished without understanding. He no longer fed simply because hunger demanded it. The boy's presence reminded him of something he had buried long ago: choice. One night, the boy asked, "Were you always a king?" The vampire king looked away toward the dark sky. "No. What were you before?" The king hesitated. "Human." The boy's eyes widened. "Like me?" "Yes." The boy smiled gently. "Then you remember." The king closed his eyes. He did. The village noticed the change before they understood it. Cruel men who mocked the poor found their fortunes collapsing overnight. Those who hoarded while others starved lost everything to sudden misfortune. No blood was spilled. No bodies were found. Justice came quietly. Inevitably. And always the boy remained untouched. When questioned, he answered simply, "I'm not alone." One evening, the boy arrived in the forest carrying a scarf he had mended himself. He held it out awkwardly. "You looked cold," he said. The vampire king stared at the cloth for a long moment before taking it. He wrapped it around his wrist, not because he needed warmth but because the boy had noticed. That night, the forest felt warmer. The king realized something terrifying then. He was no longer watching the boy to protect him. He was protecting the boy because he cared. And care was dangerous. Care led to loss. But when the boy smiled up at him, unafraid, the king knew he would accept the risk. For the first time in 300 years he was not alone. And for the first time the forest did not feel like a prison. It felt like home. The village changed before it understood why. It began with small things, quiet things. A sense that something unseen had shifted just beyond the edge of daily life. Doors that once slammed in the faces of the poor now closed more gently. Voices lowered when speaking cruelty. Eyes lingered longer on the boy who walked the frozen paths without fear. People noticed that winter no longer felt quite so sharp around him. The boy still lived in the same broken house at the village's edge. The roof still leaked when snow melted. The walls still groaned in the wind. But his mother laughed now. She moved again. Color had returned to her cheeks and hope, thin but stubborn, had taken root where despair once lived. That alone drew attention. In a village that survived by measuring worth in coin and strength, recovery without explanation bred suspicion. Too lucky, some whispered. Too quiet, others muttered. And where suspicion grows, cruelty is never far behind. The men came at dusk. They wore heavy boots and false confidence, cloaked in the belief that power belonged only to those who claimed it loudly. They said the land the boy's house sat on was no longer his. That unpaid debts had been discovered. That laws could be bent when the weak stood in the way. The boy stood in the doorway, small hands clenched at his sides. "This is our home," he said. One of the men laughed. "Homes are for people who can protect them." They pushed past him. The boy did not scream. He did not beg. He stepped outside and looked toward the forest. The sky darkened. Deep within the blackthorn, the vampire king felt it instantly. A ripple of intent. Fear not born of hunger or illness, but of injustice. His attention snapped toward the village, senses sharpening as ancient anger stirred beneath his control. Someone had crossed a line. He moved. Shadows bent. Snow parted. The forest seemed to lean inward as he passed, recognizing its ruler answering a call not of blood, but of duty. When he arrived, the men were dragging furniture from the house, tossing it into the snow with careless force. The boy's mother cried out in protest, her voice trembling but fierce. Then the air changed. Cold deepened. The men froze. The vampire king stood at the edge of the yard, tall and silent, his presence pressing down like a storm about to break. His eyes swept over the scene, over the boy standing unflinching, over the woman clutching her shawl, over the men who suddenly understood what they had awakened. "Leave," the king said. His voice was calm, terrifyingly so. One man laughed nervously. "This doesn't concern." The shadows moved. Not violently. Not chaotically. They wrapped around the men's ankles, pinning them in place. Panic surged, raw and helpless. They screamed. They begged. They promised. The vampire king stepped forward. "You prey on those who cannot fight back," he said evenly. "You mistake silence for weakness." He looked down at the boy. "Is this what they have done to you?" The boy nodded once. That was enough. The shadows released the men, not into safety but into truth. Their lies were dragged into the open. Debts they had hidden were exposed. Crimes whispered behind closed doors surfaced all at once. By morning they were gone, stripped of status, wealth, and protection. Alive but broken by the knowledge that the world now saw them clearly. Justice had come. And it had chosen a side. The village woke in fear. They had seen the shadows. Felt the cold. Heard the story spread like wildfire. Doors stayed shut. Curtains twitched. People spoke in whispers thick with dread. But the boy walked openly through the streets. And nothing touched him. The vampire king did not hide this time. He stood beside the boy at the edge of the forest, visible to all who dared look. Cloak falling like night itself, eyes sharp with ancient authority. A challenge. A promise. He was no longer only a monster in the dark. He was a line drawn in the snow. "Why do you help me?" the boy asked quietly that evening. They stood beneath the blackthorn trees, moonlight glinting off frost-covered branches. The forest felt different now, less watchful, more aligned. The vampire king looked at the child for a long moment before answering. "Because someone once stood between me and cruelty," he said. "And I forgot what that meant." The boy thought about that, then nodded. "I'm glad you remembered." The words struck deeper than the king expected. From that night on the rules changed. Cruelty no longer went unnoticed. A shopkeeper who mocked hunger found his shelves empty the next day, his hoarded goods spoiled beyond use. A landlord who evicted widows discovered his properties condemned overnight by sudden collapses and revealed corruption. No blood was spilled. No innocent was harmed. Justice arrived quietly but completely. The vampire king did not act out of rage. He acted with precision, guided by something new. Something steady. The boy watched it all, learning not how to punish, but how to protect. "Power doesn't mean taking," the king told him one night as they stood watching the village lights flicker uncertainly. "It means standing between harm and those who cannot stop it themselves." The boy absorbed the words like truth written into bone. Fear slowly gave way to something else. Respect. Villagers began leaving offerings, not to appease the king, but to honor the protection they had seen. Food appeared at the boy's doorstep. Blankets. Firewood. No one spoke of it openly. But kindness, once awakened, spreads quietly. One evening, a child from the village approached the boy hesitantly, holding a loaf of bread. "For your mother," she whispered before running away. The boy smiled. The vampire king watched from the trees, something warm and dangerous blooming in his chest. This was not conquest. This was change. As winter loosened its grip, the forest seemed to breathe easier. Animals returned. Snow melted faster near the boy's home. The line between village and forest blurred, not with fear but with balance. The vampire king stood atop a ridge one night, looking out over the land he had ruled through terror for centuries. For the first time he understood what it meant to reign. Not as a tyrant, but as a guardian. And below him, unaware of the weight he carried, the boy laughed as his mother called him inside. The sound echoed into the forest. And the king smiled. Power changes shape when it is no longer feared. The vampire king learned this slowly, not through conquest or bloodshed, but through silence. The kind that follows when cruelty realizes it no longer has a place to stand. Winter loosened its grip on the land, and with it the old balance shifted. Snow still fell, but it no longer felt like a threat. It felt like rest. The forest changed first. The blackthorn no longer pressed in with warning shadows when villagers passed near its edge. Paths cleared themselves not by axe or blade, but by a strange, natural order. Branches bent away. Thorns retreated. The forest, once a boundary of death, had become a living border of protection. And at the center of that change stood a boy. He grew slowly but surely. Not taller by much, not yet, but steadier. His shoulders squared when he walked. His eyes lifted when others looked away. He still wore patched clothes. Still lived in a house repaired with borrowed wood and stubborn hope. But people noticed something else now. He was never alone. Even when no one stood beside him, the air itself seemed to listen. The villagers spoke in whispers, careful and respectful. They had learned the lesson cruelty teaches only once when it is answered properly. They had seen men with power reduced to nothing without a single drop of blood spilled. They had seen justice arrive without warning, and leave without apology. They had seen the vampire king stand openly in defense of a child. Fear had not vanished, but it had transformed. It had sharpened into awareness, into restraint, into respect. The boy noticed it too. When he walked through the market, voices softened. When he passed a dispute, it settled quickly. Children no longer mocked his worn boots. Some even followed him, curious, wide-eyed, as if proximity alone might grant them safety. One afternoon, as the boy carried firewood home, he stopped and looked back toward the forest. "Why do they listen now?" he asked quietly. The vampire king emerged from the shadows beside him, silent as ever. "Because they understand consequences," he replied. The boy frowned slightly. "I don't think that's all." The king studied him. "What do you think?" "They listen because they see someone standing up for people like us," the boy said after a moment. "They're afraid of being on the wrong side of that." The vampire king's lips curved, not quite a smile but something close. "You see more than most kings I have known." The boy laughed softly. "I'm not a king." "No," the vampire king agreed. "But you are the reason one remembered what ruling meant." Change spread outward, quiet and relentless. Travelers passing through the land noticed it first. Roads once plagued by bandits grew safe. Inns once known for cheating the desperate began offering fair prices. Word spread, not of terror but of order. "This land answers cruelty," they said, "and it protects its own." No one spoke the vampire king's name aloud. They didn't need to. Deep within the forest, ancient things stirred. Not enemies. Not threats. Witnesses. Creatures that had slept for centuries beneath root and stone sensed the shift in the king's rule. He no longer hunted blindly. He no longer fed without purpose. He weighed lives. He chose. That kind of power had a gravity of its own. One night, beneath a sky heavy with stars, the vampire king stood at a clearing long forgotten. Stone pillars jutted from the earth, cracked and overgrown, remnants of a throne that once symbolized domination. He had not stood there since the night he became what he was. The boy joined him, breath visible in the cold air. "What is this place?" he asked. "A throne," the king said. "Or what remains of one." The boy looked around. "It doesn't look very strong." The king nodded. It wasn't. He reached out, brushing snow from one of the stones. I ruled from fear. From hunger. That kind of throne always breaks. The boy was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "So why are we here?" The vampire king looked down at him, eyes ancient and searching. "Because something new must be built. And I will not build it alone." He did not declare himself ruler again. There were no ceremonies. No kneeling crowds. No blood oaths. Instead, the vampire king began to listen. He listened when the forest spoke, when balance tipped too far, when prey vanished too quickly, when storms threatened villages unprepared. He listened when the boy spoke, when kindness was needed, when patience mattered more than punishment. Together they walked the land. The boy learned the weight of decisions. The king learned the cost of care. When a farmer hoarded grain while others starved, the king did not destroy him. He took the excess and distributed it quietly. The farmer woke to find his stores empty, but his neighbors fed. When a merchant lied to the poor, his lies followed him. Customers vanished. Truth caught up. Justice became predictable. And because it was predictable, cruelty faded. One evening, the boy asked the question he had been holding back. "Do you ever get tired?" he asked, sitting beside the king on a fallen log. The vampire king considered this. "I have lived 300 years without rest," he said. "This is the first time I have felt purpose." The boy nodded. "My mother says purpose makes hard things lighter." The king looked toward the village, where lanterns glowed warmly against the dark. "She is wise." The people began to change too. Not out of fear, but imitation. Children shared food. Adults intervened when cruelty surfaced. The village learned something powerful. Justice didn't require a monster. It required courage. The vampire king watched it unfold with something close to awe. He had ruled through terror, and the world had remained broken. He ruled through mercy, and the world began to heal itself. On the first night of spring, the forest bloomed. Not with flowers, but with life. Birds returned. Streams thawed. The air softened. The boy stood barefoot at the forest edge, smiling up at the sky. "Winter's over," he said. The vampire king stood beside him, cloak resting lightly on his shoulders. "No," he replied. "Something older ended." The boy looked at him. "What happens now?" The king looked out over the land, over the village, the forest, the quiet peace hard-won and fragile. "Now," he said, "we guard what was built." The boy grinned. "Together?" The vampire king inclined his head. "Always." That night, beneath stars unclouded by fear, the vampire king returned to the ruined throne. He did not sit upon it. Instead he shattered it. Stone cracked. Ancient symbols fell to dust. Power rooted in domination crumbled at his feet. And when he turned away, the forest stood taller. The throne he chose could not be seen. It was built in trust. In restraint. In the courage of a child who had once whispered for mercy. And because of that, the land would never be ruled the same way again. Time moved differently after that. Not faster. Not slower. Just steadier. Spring settled fully into the land, gentle and deliberate, as if afraid to undo what had been so carefully rebuilt. Snow retreated into shaded corners of the forest. Streams swelled and laughed again. The blackthorn no longer felt like a wound carved into the earth. It felt alive, watchful, yes, but no longer hostile. And at the heart of that balance stood the vampire king and the boy. The boy grew. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. Growth came the way it always does for those who have known hunger, quietly, patiently, inch by inch. His shoulders broadened. His voice deepened. But more than that, something inside him settled into place. He walked with purpose now. People noticed how he listened before speaking. How he never raised his voice, yet somehow carried authority. Children followed him instinctively. Adults paused when he entered a room, not out of fear but respect. He had never asked for it. That was why it stayed. The boy's mother lived to see the land change completely. She sat often outside their repaired home, sunlight warming her face, watching children play where fear once ruled. She knew, though she never spoke it aloud, that her survival had been the turning point. That her son had carried something rare into the forest that night long ago. Mercy. Sometimes, when the vampire king visited, she would incline her head politely. Never bowing. Never shrinking. He returned the gesture every time. Respect, offered freely, was sacred to him now. The village no longer whispered the word monster. They spoke instead of balance, of fairness, of a presence that watched, not to punish without cause, but to ensure that no one was forgotten the way they once had been. The vampire king no longer appeared only at night. He walked openly at dusk, his cloak no longer a symbol of terror, but of boundary. A reminder. Do no harm here. And if you do, answer for it. One evening, as golden light stretched long shadows across the fields, the boy and the vampire king stood at the edge of the forest together. You're quieter lately, the boy said. The king nodded. My work is nearly finished. The boy frowned. Finished? Yes. The word carried weight. For centuries, the king continued, I believed the world needed a ruler who inspired fear. Someone eternal. Unchanging. He looked down at the boy. I was wrong. The boy felt a tightening in his chest. Are you leaving? The king did not answer immediately. Instead, he gestured toward the village. Toward the people who now defended one another without waiting for shadows to intervene. Toward children who shared food without being told. Toward a land that corrected itself before cruelty took root. You are no longer powerless, the king said softly. None of you are. The boy understood then, not abandonment but succession. Not of a throne. Of responsibility. The final test came quietly. It always does. A group of strangers arrived from beyond the hills, men hardened by places where cruelty still ruled. They tested boundaries. Took more than they gave. Watched to see if fear would answer. It did not. When they tried to seize food meant for the village's poorest, they found themselves surrounded, not by shadows but by people. Men, women, children, standing together. The vampire king watched from the forest's edge as the boy stepped forward. This land doesn't belong to you, the boy said calmly. And it doesn't belong to me either. The men laughed. Until they felt it. Not fear but consequence. The land itself resisted them. Paths twisted. Supplies spoiled. Their lies were exposed before they could take hold. And when they fled they did so not chased, but unwelcome. The vampire king smiled. They had done it without him. That night, beneath a sky thick with stars, the vampire king returned to the deepest part of the blackthorn forest. To the place where shadows were born. The boy followed. You don't have to go, the boy said, his voice steady but tight. The king knelt so they were eye to eye. I do, he replied gently. Because if I stay you will rely on me when you no longer should. The boy swallowed. Will I see you again? The king considered this. When kindness is tested, he said, I will be there. But you won't need to see me to know it. He placed a hand over the boy's heart. You already carry what made me change. The forest responded. Light filtered through branches that had never allowed it before. Thorns receded. The blackthorn breathed, deep and slow. The vampire king stood, shadows gathering around him one final time. You saved me, he said. The boy shook his head. I just asked you not to take. The king smiled fully then, no fangs, no threat. Just memory. And I listened. With that he stepped backward into the forest. And vanished. Years passed. Stories spread far beyond the hills. Of a land where the poor were not invisible. Where power answered kindness. Where monsters did not rule, people did. The boy grew into a man. He never claimed authority. He never needed to. When disputes arose he listened. When wrongs were done he ensured they were corrected without cruelty. When strangers arrived they were judged not by appearance, but by action. The forest remained. Quiet. Watching. On the anniversary of that winter night, the man walked alone into the blackthorn forest. He carried a small sack. Inside was bread. He placed it on a familiar stone and spoke softly into the air. Thank you. The forest stirred. For just a moment the shadows shifted, not with menace but acknowledgement. Then stillness returned. The land endured. Not because it was ruled by power, but because it remembered mercy. And in a world that never expected kindness to survive the dark, that memory became the strongest force of all.